Okay, good evening to everyone. So we are continuing in Yeshayahu. I'll just a brief recap of what we spoke about last time. So we were in the prophecies of Yeshayahu in chapter 5, Perek, where he has this whole series of prophecies starting with the word Hoy, which is sort of like a cry in anguish. And we stated there that, hi, good evening, Margaret.
Good evening, Diane.
Good evening. So we stated there, and he has this whole series of prophecies, each beginning with the word Hoy, and essentially he's sort of crying out on anguish. And we said he's discussing, as he's done also in previous chapters, the upper echelon of society. He's speaking about the Assyrian, the wealthy, were taking advantage and taking property away from the poor. He was speaking about the Chachamim as well. And we saw a few very interesting points regarding that. Let me just remind you what we saw. Let me try and share the screen. 1 second. So we saw him speaking about here the people who were using music and wine. And we tried to explain on the basis of comparison to where else the music and the combination of music and wine appears, that it wasn't people who were merely drinking and partying, but rather it was people who were trying to reach a certain level of prophecy and spirituality. And what these people were essentially claiming, as can be seen from the continuation, is that they were claiming, as Yeshayahu said, they were seeing everything in reverse. Okay, they were האומרים לרע טוב ולטוב רע שמים חושך לאור ואור לחושך שמים מר למתוק ומתוק למר. In other words, Yeshayahu is saying they have everything reversed, and on the basis of the comparison to the similar psukim that we had in Amos, who was speaking about, let me just see it a little bit lower, in Amos, in chapter 5 in Amos, where he says, Hoya mitavim et yom Hashem, lama ze lachem yom Hashem uchoshech velo or. In other words, the reverse of light to dark and dark to light was that these people were claiming that there's a Yom Hashem arriving, which they thought is a day of redemption, of Geulah. And in essence, Yeshayahu is telling them the reverse is actually true. The day of darkness is coming, okay? And we'll see later on in the chapter a little bit more specifically what this is referring to. Now, why is this so severe? The fact that they are claiming that there's this redemption on its way. Okay, so they have it wrong. They're claiming that there's good, the future holds good, and Yeshayahu is telling no, there's a big darkness awaiting actually in the future. Why is this crime so severe? So the answer is, this is what Yeshayahu speaks about. Let me go back to the verses that are referring to it. He says, Hoy moshchei, here in verse number 18, he says, Hoy moshchei ha'avon bechavlei hashav, uche'avot ha'agala chata'a. In other words, these people are those who haul sins with cords of falsehood and inquiry as with cart hoops. In other words, what they're essentially doing is that these people, it's sort of, what's the parable that he's using here? He's describing the sin as being like a carriage. And these people with these words, they're the ropes pulling the carriage. Why are they doing that? How are the words coming? Because what they're saying is, האומרים, ימהר יחיש המעשה ולמען נראה, ותקרא ותבוא עצת גדות ישראל ונדע. In other words, they say, let him speed, let him hasten his purpose. If we are to give thought, let the plans of the holy ones of Israel be quickly fulfilled if we are to give heed. In other words, they're saying, we want whatever is coming to arrive quickly. In other words, again, this ties into what they were saying, that the future holds good. The problem is that essentially these words of them were causing the sinning to continue. In other words, if you think that good is coming on the way, then you assume that I must be doing something good, which is what the people at the time assumed. So the people were not listening to Yeshayahu because Yeshayahu essentially was trying to tell them what's happening here is very bad, okay, and you have to change your ways if you want to fix it. But they were not listening, and essentially, this was a combination of the wealthy behaving in their way, the leaders behaving in their unjust ways, and these chachamim who were also partners to the crime by providing the spiritual justification, and by them telling everybody the redemption is on its way, keep it up. In other words, we're doing something good here. That was sort of continuing and not enabling any chance of trying to see maybe something is wrong here and something should be changed. Okay. So here we have, just to wrap up, the other hoys that we haven't seen yet. So from verse number 21, hoy chachamim beinehem v'neged pneihem nevunim. Those who are so wise in their own opinion, so clever in their own judgment. Again, this is Yeshayahu. He's continuing to address the same crowd who claim to be the wise men, but that's only in their eyes. In other words, truthfully, it's not so. Truthfully, they're not seeing what's going to happen. They've got everything reversed, as we said earlier. And finally, the last group in verse number 22, Hoy giborim lishtot yain v'anshei chayil limsoch shechar. Those who are so doughty as drinkers of wine and so valiant as mixers of drink. In other words, again, this is a continuation of the same idea that they're using their powers not for, in other words, they're not actually being able to use the wine and the drink to uplift spirits. In other words, it's just remaining as drinking, and that's all there is, nothing beyond that. Okay, and as he says in verse number 23, Matzdikei rasha ekev shochad, b'tzidkat tzadikim yasir mimenu, who vindicate him who is in the wrong in return for a bribe, and withhold vindication from who is in the right. Okay, this continues, as we saw already from chapter 1. He keeps speaking about the lack of justice in Yerushalayim at that time, and therefore the result is, in verse number 24, L'chen ke'echol kash lishon ish v'chashash le'ava yirpeh shorsham kamak yeh ufircham ka'avak ya'aleh ki ma'asu et Torat Adonai tzvaot ve'et imrat kedosh Yisrael niyetzu. Assuredly, as straw is consumed by a tongue of fire, and hay shrivels as it burns, their stock shall become like rot, and their buds shall blow away like dust, for they have rejected the instructions of the Lord of the hosts, spurned the word of the Holy One of Israel. Where have we already seen this idea of fire? Anybody remember? In Yeshayahu?
Yes, we saw it. In the beginning of, when the coals.
Right, this is a repeated idea, as we saw when we studied already, we studied it first, chapter 6, where he speaks about the right, about the fire, Yeshayahu himself being purified by the fire, but everybody else being burned by the fire. So again, he's repeating the same imagery of using the fire as a symbol for the burning away of the kingdom of Yehuda. Okay, and also at the end of chapter 1, I think he used also the same imagery. Okay, so that sums up the series of prophecies of Hoy. Now I want to continue to the last section in chapter 5, which we'll read now. Let me open up the next source pages. Okay, it's not long. All we have left is verses from 25 to 30 at the end of chapter 5. And here we finally get to, what's actually a little bit more detail on what's actually going to happen. In other words, Yeshayahu keeps speaking about this humbling of man, this destruction that's going to come, this exile, etc., everything that's going to happen, but he hasn't really specified what's going to happen until now. Okay, and here he begins to a little bit more specify about what actually is going to happen. Okay, so let's read it. So as we read it, try and see what is he actually describing here? What is he saying that's going to happen? Okay, so we'll read from 25 to 30, and then we'll analyze a little bit. So he says, Al ken chara af Adonai be'amo, vayet yado alav, vayakehu, vayirgezu ha'arim, ותהי נבלתם כסוכה בקרב חוצות, בקרב חוצות, בכל זאת לא שבה פה, ועוד ידו נטויה. This is why the Lord's anger was roused against his people, why he stretched out his arm against it and struck it, so that the mountains quaked, and its corpses lay like refuse in the streets, yet his anger has not turned back, and his arm is outstretched still. ונשא נס לגויים מרחוק, ושרק לו מקצה הארץ, והנה מהרה קל יבוא. He will raise an ensign to a nation afar, whistle to one at the end of the earth. There it comes with lightning speed. אין עייף ואין כושל בו, לא ינום ולא יישן, ולא נפתח אזור חלצה, ולא ניתק שרוך נעליו. In its ranks none is weary or stumbles, they never sleep or slumber, the belts on their waist do not come loose, nor do the thongs of their sandals breaks. אשר חיציו שנונים, וכל קשתותיו דרוכות, פרסות סוסיו, קצר נחשבו וגלגליו כסופה. Their arrows are sharpened, and all their bows are drawn, their horses' hoofs are like flint, their chariot wheels like the whirlwind. שאגה לו כלביא ישאג, ככפירים, וינהום ויאחז טרף, ויפליט מאין ואין מציל. Their roaring is like a lion's. They roar like the great beasts. When they growl and seize a prey, they carry it off, and none can recover it. וינהום עליו ביום ההוא כנהמת ים, וניבט לארץ והנה חושך צר ואור חשך בעריפיה. But on that day a roaring shall resound over him like that of the sea, and then he shall look below and behold distressing darkness with light, darkness in its lowering clouds. So what does Yeshayahu describe here? What's going to happen? Essentially, if you try to weave your way through all these poetic words, what essentially is going to happen, according to what he says?
Army's going to come and destroy them.
Exactly. So basically, he's prophesying about a faraway nation that's going to come with its army, and it's going to basically roll over everything and destroy everything in its path. Who is he referring to? Which army? Anybody know?
Assyria, isn't it?
The Assyrians, right, exactly. Ashur, that's the big empire that's going to rise a little after this time, and it's going to have a devastating effect on the entire region. Correct. Okay, so we said the big army is coming. That's essentially. What other things do you notice here which are similar to things we've already seen in Yeshayahu's prophecies?
Darkness and distress.
What?
Talking about the darkness and it's going to be the reverse. It's not going to be good, it's going to be choshech.
Exactly. So very good. So you have in verse number 30, excellent. Hineh choshech. Essentially, the darkness that's arriving is this big army from far away. That's essentially, what's going to darken the world. Okay, very good. What else do we have here besides the darkness? Anybody notice something else we've already mentioned a number of times?
Dead people.
The speed with which it's going to happen as well?
It is going to happen with speed. Okay, that's not what I was referring to, but good, right? In other words, they spoke about something arriving speedily, the goodness, and he's saying in reverse, we're going to have the speedy army all of a sudden arrive.
The trembling hills like an earthquake.
Very good. Very good. Here in verse number 25, Virgezu ha'arim, we have the mountains quaking. Again, this is a reference to also to the earthquake that we had in the times of Uzziah, which is part of the symbol of what's ahead. All right, very good. Okay.
What about the references to Tehillim?
What do you mean?
Well, some of the verses also bear a resemblance to certain of the Tehillim. I mean, not slumber nor sleep. Some
Yeah, very good. There are actually quite a
the
few
hills
references.
and the mountains moving.
Right. I wasn't planning to go into that too much, but actually you're quite right. There are quite a few similar parallels to Tehillim, both on the Yirgezu Harim. We have it in a few places in Tehillim. Let me just
You've got it in Psalm 29 when he says, Havud Hashem b'nei kelim.
I'm sorry?
Yes,
Right,
I
we
said
have in the
Psalm 29, yeah.
Right, and we also have, very good, we also have another place. Let me just, I have it in my notes. Just 1 second, let me try and find it. Yeah, you usually be saying reference to Hashem, lo yanum v'lo yishan, but here it says in reference to the army. We also have in the Perek Yudchet in Tehillim, v'tig'ash v'tirash ha'aretz u'mofdei harim yirgazu v'yidgashu ki charalo. That's the one I listed in my notes.
Rabbi, could you clarify one thing that Flora mentioned with Yeshayahu? Is this actually a prophecy for the Assyrian conquest in 722 BCE or the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE or both?
I mean, from what I saw, at least most of the classical commentators, like the Radak and the Barbanellas, I think we'll see, say it refers to the Assyrians, which was within Yeshayahu's time. So it makes sense that he was referring to
Yeshayahu because he extends over such a period. In chapter 45, he refers to Koresh, which is 520 BC after the Babylonian conquest. Yeah.
Okay, that's another whole issue about that whole section of Yeshayahu. You're correct, but okay, I discussed that a little bit when we started studying Yeshayahu. But no problem. But here these chapters, at least, you know, I'm following the interpretation of my father-in-law, Rav Carmel, in his book, that these chapters in the beginning of Yeshayahu were said at the times of Uzziyahu, and we already know that a little bit afterwards. And you see this already in chapter 7, where we shift over to the times of Achaz, the grandson of Uzziyahu. Then already the Assyrians are on the way, and so it makes sense that he's referring to sort of the near future, which was in other words, the time of Uzziyahu itself, as we know in the book of Divrei Yamim, was a time of a tremendous success. You know, the wealth, the borders expanding. And Yeshayahu is speaking about a darkness arriving and changing all of that. So it makes sense that he was referring to the nearer future of the Assyrians. I think that's why, at least that's why the classical commentators.
Yes. Well, that's why I said it, because Yeshayahu's whole thrust is don't look at what's looming in the horizon. You know, the Aram coming and whatever, Ashur coming. You know, no, it's Aram, Assyria. Yeah, that's Aram. Yes. You know, that was his whole prophecy. He was a prophet statesman about the Assyrians.
Okay, I'll try now to bring a little bit more proof that it's referring to Ashur. And I would like to focus on a certain expression that we have here in these verses. And that is as follows. In verse number 25, he says, Bechol zot lo shava po, ve'od nado yetuya. Okay, he says, yet his anger has not turned back, and his arm is outstretched still. Okay, now this expression appears once here in this chapter, but if you continue later on to chapter 9, there's a whole prophecy here that further develops this idea of bechol zot lo shava po velo yado netuya. Okay, I don't want to read it too much in detail, but I just want to show you how it appears. Okay, it starts in chapter 9, verse 7. Okay, it starts off, Davar shalach Adonai b'Yaakov, v'nafal b'Yisrael, my Lord let loose a word against Jacob, and it fell upon Israel. In other words, this is obviously a negative prophecy which is coming. וידעו העם כולו אפרים ויושב שומרון בגאווה ובגודל לבב לאמור. But all the people noted Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria in arrogance and haughtiness. Again, it's the idea Yeshayahu keeps speaking about the arrogance. לבנים נפלו וגזית נבנה, שקמים גודו וארזים נחליף, bricks have fallen, we will rebuild with dressed stone, sycamores have been felled, will grow cedar instead. ויסגב אדוני את צורי רצין עליו, ואת אויביו יסכסך. Okay, all right, I don't want to dwell on all the details. It says, ארם מקדם ופלישתים מאחור ויאכלו את ישראל בכל פה, בכל זאת לא שב אפו ועוד ידו נטויה. The exact same expression. Yet his anger has not turned back and his arm is outstretched still. But nevertheless, it did not yet help. והעם לא שב עד המכהו ואת אדוני צבאות לא דרשו. For the people has not turned back to whom who struck it and has not sought the Lord of hosts. Okay? And then it continues with a further negative prophecy. ויחרט אדוני מישראל ראש בזנב, כיפה ואגמון ביום אחד. So the Lord will cut off from Israel head and tail, palm branch and reed in a single day. זקן ונשוא פנים הוא הראש, ונביא מורה שקר הוא הזנב. Elders and magnates, such are the heads. Prophets who give false instruction, such are the tails. By the way, where did we see a prophecy about cutting off all the leaders? Anybody remember?
We had it all. We had it with us.
We had it very much in detail.
Yeah, we had it with Amos, no?
No, also in Yeshayahu himself.
Yeshayahu, we said Yeshayahu, yeah.
Yeah, if in chapter 3, he had the long lists of all the people. Nevertheless, here at the end, also again, in verse number 16, he says again, בכל זאת לא שב אפו ועוד ידו נטויה. Okay, nevertheless, his anger and his hand is still outstretched on them. Okay, and he continues again, further very negative prophecies, both on Ephraim and on Yehuda. And he says here in verse number 20 again, בכל זאת לא שב אפו ועוד ידו יטויה. Again, yet his anger has not turned back and his arm is outstretched still. And if you go on to chapter 10, again, he speaks about the people who are not doing justice. Those who write out evil writs and compose iniquitous documents. To subvert the cause of the poor, to rob of their rights the needy of my people, that widows may be their spoil and fatherless children their booty. Okay, and he says here also, בכל זאת לא שב אפו ועוד ידו נטויה. Again, yet his anger has not turned back and his arm is outstretched still. Now, what is the anger of God and what is his hand? That he says in the next verse, which is the opening of the next prophecy, Hoy Ashur shevet api. Umatehu veyadam zami. Ha, Assyria, rod of my anger, in whose hand as a staff is my fury. Okay, so when God speaks about my anger has not turned back and his arm is outstretched still, who is God's anger? Who is God's hand? Who is that?
Assyria.
Assyria, exactly. In other words, he's revealing to you God's anger in the world against the behavior of Yehuda, Shomron, etc. At that time, his anger is Assyria. In other words, they need to understand that Assyria, which is coming now, it's not really Assyria. It's really, God has called Assyria. Now, actually, if you go on in Yeshayahu in that chapter, he also takes issue with Ashur for not realizing its own position as really being the rod of Hashem's anger, okay? But at least from the position of the people of Judah, from the people of Israel, that's what they need to understand, and that's what they don't understand. Okay, that's what he says here earlier. What they don't realize, the people have not turned back to him who struck it. In other words, when they're being hit, or where they will be hit by by Assyria, they need to realize that it's not really Assyria hitting them, it's Hashem. But they're obviously not understanding that. Okay. But
Diane, does it divert you from what you want to talk about if I ask you whether it's possible to infer a wider lesson from all of this, that all the persecutors through history of the people of Israel have been the hand of God?
Yeah.
The rod
no,
of God.
that's of course correct. Of course it's correct. Anytime that, that's what the Rambam writes about. Anytime that we're hit by something, we have to, take that as a lesson, to correct our behaviors, for sure.
Including the COVID.
What?
Including the COVID.
Apparently, including the COVID, of course. But certainly that is the case with Ashur, as at least in and this is also, it's very powerful the way Yeshayahu is describing it, because if you go back to our chapter, let's look back how he describes it. ונשא נס לגויים מרחוק, ושרק לו מקצה הארץ. In other words, it's describing Hashem, again, this is a continuation of B'chol zot lo shava po v'od yado netuya, about God's anger and his arm being outstretched still. He's the one that's calling Ashur to come. Sharak lo miktzeh haaretz, he's whistling to Ashur from the end of the earth to come to Israel, okay? And in other words, Ashur is arriving at Hashem's behest, okay? And this is the idea of him developing here. He says it here, B'chol zot lo shava po v'od yado netuya, and this is what he goes on to develop further in chapters 9 and 10 about the anger of God and Hoy Ashur shevet hapi, Ashur being the rod of God's anger. Okay, and that's why I think it fits well to say that these verses here are referring to Ashur. If you put these chapters together.
Diane, you mentioned in those verses in chapter 9 that you were reading before, there was quite a few references to Judah, to Yehuda, as the object of the punishment, and yet Judah was spared effectively. I mean, the Assyrian assault was really against the other tribes, was it? So does that sort of bear out maybe Jeffrey's point that maybe this could be referring to a later assault, not just Assyria's assault?
No, Judah was definitely not spared from the Assyrian assault. They had it not as terrible as Israel. Israel was ultimately completely exiled, and Yehuda survived. But other than that, all the other cities of Yehuda were decimated, and there was a tremendous devastation to Yehuda as well. That's described explicitly. So the difference between Yehuda and Israel is that Israel basically, ultimately, after a sequence of Assyrian conquest, Israel was completely destroyed, and Yehuda somehow survived, but barely. It was definitely not ultimately not spared from the Assyrians. They just didn't have it as bad.
The only comfort is, Diane, that all these people who overstepped their mark, like the Babylonians and the Egyptians, that they were punished because they went over what Hashem wanted of them. They were cruel.
Correct. I didn't get into that, but that's what in Yeshayahu and Perek Yud, that's what he goes on to speak about Ashur, that Ashur ultimately will also be punished for what they had done. But at least at some level of what they had done, they were merely a rod of God's anger, although at some point apparently they overstepped that. Okay. Now I want to see an interesting piece from the Talmud on this idea of B'chol zot lo shava po v'od yado netuya, which sort of can change a little bit our perspective on it. Let's see. This is something very interesting. Okay, let's go down a little bit. Okay, This is from Chagiga, Daf Hey Amud Bet 5b in Masechet Chagiga. Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, Avakai bei Kaisar. Okay, so Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya was standing in the house of the Caesar. Achavi leyahu mina ama dehadrinu marei le'apei. So a certain heretic who was also present gestured to him, indicating that his was the nation whose master God turned his face away from it. Rabbi Yeshua gestured to him that his hand is outstretched over us. Here the translator is adding in the words in protection. Okay, but literally it just says his hand is outstretched over us. Amar le Kesar el Rabbi Yoshua, ma yachavi lach? What did he gesture to you? So he answers, Ama da'atrinu marei le'apei minei, ve'ana machivna le yado netuya aleinu. Okay, in other words, so you told the Caesar, his nation whose master turned his face from it, and I gestured to him that his hand is outstretched over us. Okay, now this is very interesting. We have here, on the one hand, the heretic claiming that God has turned away from Israel. In other words, Israel is essentially no longer the chosen nation. And Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya is answering with what expression? Yado netuya aleinu. His hand is outstretched over us. Now, the particular choice of words here, Yado netuya aleinu, if we just read the Gemara as is, Yado netuya aleinu, okay, his hand is outstretched over us. But if we look at the connotation of Yado netuya aleinu from the expression of Yeshayahu, ve'od Yado netuya, od Yado netuya, as we saw in Yeshayahu, his hands is outstretched over us. It's not a good thing, it's a bad thing. In other words, his hand is outstretched over us to punish us. So why is Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, who's trying to claim that Israel is still the chosen nation, his arm is outstretched over us, why is he using an expression which is actually in its source very negative? So Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, not the latest one that we know from America, but his great-grandfather, Beit HaLevi, who was in Volozhin, he has an interesting explanation for this. And he says as follows, for this I don't have a translation, so I'll just read it and try to translate. It says, B'masechet Chagiga ita, in other words, in Tractate Chagiga, it says, so he made the gesture, God has turned away from you, and he said, no, his arm is outstretched over us. Marsha is a commentator on the Agadic passages in the Talmud as well. So he says the connotation of the expression in its original form in Yeshayahu is negative. It's an expression of punishment, not of God's protection over us. So he says, he brings now an interesting idea, a halachic idea, which he'll try to use to try to explain what the Gemara here means in this passage. Okay, this is very interesting. He says, "Ube'arnu zeh, al pi man de'mvo'ar bechoshen mishpat, katav atur da'aveda midat u'ifker." Okay, this is something that appears in Shulchan Aruch and Choshen Mishpat. It says that if I'm basically neglect of object of mine willfully, then it's considered hefker. Hefker means that it's basically now to the public, anybody can come and take it. What's an example? If I throw my wallet out into the street, not that I dropped it, but I purposely throw my wallet out in the street, essentially that makes it hefker, which means that basically it's open to the public. Whoever wants to can come and take my money because I've abandoned it in a public domain, purposefully, willfully abandoned it. The Ikshu Alav, and the question on the tour who writes this halacha is as follows: Mehade Baba Kama, Zarak li merosh hagag, uba acher v'shvaro b'makel, deshakil v'tarya Gemara iya shovro chayav o patur. Okay, the Gemara speaks about the following case. Let's say I throw an item from on top of the roof, and before it crashes down and breaks on the ground, somebody comes up with some sort of stick and is able in midair to break that kli, that vessel, okay? Is that person liable to pay for that or not? So the question here is as follows. If we said that, let's say I purposefully leave something in the middle of the street, essentially anybody can come and take it, right? So if I throw it off the roof, that seems to be even more of a declaration that I'm not interested in it anymore. So if I just leave it in the middle of the street, anybody can come and take it, and that means I have no ownership over it anymore. So if I throw it off a roof, clearly that should indicate that I have no interest in ownership over it anymore. And therefore, anybody who would come and either take it or break it with a stick, obviously should not have to pay me for it. In other words, because I'm considered to have abandoned it. So why is the Gemara discussing if somebody comes along with the stick and breaks it, does he have to pay for the damages? What damages it? I've abandoned it, I've thrown it off the roof. That seems to be an even more extreme case than just merely leaving it in the middle of the street. Okay? That the owner of the kli was the one that threw it off the roof. But according to the Tur, it should be at this point already in the public domain. It should be hefker. It doesn't belong to me anymore. And anybody can take it. So why should the person who decides to break it be liable for damages? Okay? So now he provides the following answer. Very interesting. He says, והפשוט, דעד כאן לא כתב הטור דנעשו הפקר, רק במניח כיסו ברשות הרבים ולא אכפת לי כלל מה שיעשה בו, אם יאבד או לא. ומשום הכי סבירה לי דנעשים הפקר. In other words, if I leave something in the middle of the street, then it doesn't belong to me anymore. I've essentially made it hefker. Anybody can come and take it. I have no interest in it any longer. Okay, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not interested anymore. You can do with it whatever you like. אבל בזורק כלי שלא לשוברו, יש לבעלים תכלית ורצון בהכלי שרוצה לשוברו עדיין הם שלו קודם שנשברו, ואינו יוצא מרשותו כלל. But if I'm throwing something off the roof to break it, that doesn't mean I'm not interested in anymore. I'm still interested in it. In what regard I'm interested in it? I'm interested in that I want to break it. So it's not the same as leaving something in the middle of the street. Leaving something in the middle of the street, I don't care what happens to it. It can break, somebody else can take it. But if I throw it off the roof, that means I want to break it. Okay? So therefore, if somebody comes and breaks it, comes with a stick and breaks it before my throwing has managed to break it, then he's sort of violated my ownership, because I had still rights to that kli until it actually breaks. I was still interested in being the one to break it for whatever reason. The person wanted to break it, but it's not considered that the fact that he wants to break it does not consider that he's relinquished ownership, because he's still interested in it, still has a purpose for him. The purpose could be to break it, but that's still a certain purpose and interest that he has in it. So he says this is also what the Gemara here is talking about. וזהו דהצדוקי הראה לו, אמה דאדרינו מרי לאפי מיני. וכוונתו היה שהקדוש ברוך הוא סילק רשותו מהם לגמרי ואינם עוד ברשותו שישלחם לגמרי. In other words, the Tzedaki understood what has God done to us. Essentially, he doesn't care about us anymore. He's neglected us, he's abandoned us. רק זה היה שייך אם הקדוש ברוך הוא היה מוסרם לבבל בגלות, ולא היה אכפת לי כלל במה שיעשו המה בהם, אם ירצו ישתעבדו, ואם ירצו יטיבו להם, היה שייך לומר כן לכאורה. He would have been correct, that heretic, if that was actually what God had done. In other words, if God had abandoned us and said, I don't care what happens with you, good or bad, it doesn't matter to me, then that essentially would have meant that we're no longer the chosen people. God has left us. והראה לו רבי יהושע בן חנניה דעוד ידו נטויה עלינו, דשילחם לגלות לתכלית וכוונה לסבול שם הייסורים ונענשים שם, ואם כן הרי הוא כמו זורק כלי לשוברו, דהם שלו ואינו יוצא מרשותו. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania is saying, no, עוד ידו נטויה, in other words, his arm is still outstretched over us to punish us. So it is a negative connotation. In other words, his arm is still outstretched over us to punish us, but that doesn't mean that he's neglected us. In other words, the expression of Od Yadon Netuya is negative in the sense that he's going to continue to punish us. But from the fact that he's continuing to punish us, that means he's ultimately still interested in us. He hasn't abandoned us. Okay? In other words, yes, he's sending the Assyrians. Yes, his arm is outstretched, but it continues to be outstretched throughout, even while we're being punished, because essentially, ultimately, the goal is, to correct our ways and to bring us back. So that's the sort of the connotation of Od Yadone Tuya, also taking out a positive message that throughout the punishment, God is still involved. It's not like he's just abandoning us, to whatever happens in the world, but rather he's there with us throughout even these negative time periods.
Rabbi, could I just, I understood that verse from the very beginning as a layman, V'od yado netuya, but still his hand is outstretched to save us, because the main connotation of a mighty hand and an outstretched arm is the way in which we were saved by the Almighty in Yetziat Mitzrayim. And I would have thought that that connotation was very much in favor of the idea that the Almighty wanted to not give us up and to save us for protection still.
So you're interpreting differently. In other words, B'chol zot lo shava po, his anger has not yet calmed down, it's not yet returned. But on the other hand, Od Yadone Tuya, to save us.
Yeah, 100%. I must say, Rabbi Diane, I also felt that in the beginning when I first read it. I thought of Yad Chazaka B'Zro Netuya in a very positive way. Yeah, I didn't say anything because
it could be. I'm not saying that that's also a possible interpretation. The reason at least I didn't understand that way, and I don't think the Beit HaLevi understood that way.
I don't think so.
If we go back to the expression that we spoke about earlier,
because it says the anger hasn't gone away, hasn't it?
Hoyashu shevet api umatehu beyadam za'ami. Okay, so he's speaking about the anger and the hand, although here it's the Assyrian's hand.
Is different. Za'ami is different.
My anger is the stick in their hands. Okay, but you see here the parallel of api, right, and the yad. Okay, that's why I thought it was both of them were speaking about the hand, the fury and the hand as being outstretched to punish. You're right that in the times of Pharaoh is to punish the Paro and the Mitzrim, but here it seems to be referring to being the punishment to Israel. Okay.
Is this chapter 5, Diane?
This is from chapter 10.
I can't see it. Okay, thank you.
This is in chapter 10.
Thank you.
Okay, perhaps your interpretation is also possible. I'm not rejecting that. I think that's the way they understood it, though, as both being referring to negative. Okay, just very quickly before we conclude, I just wanted to show you what I mentioned earlier. The Radak and the Abarbanel as saying that this is these verses referring to the Assyrians, Ashur. He says, "V'hu melech Ashur, she'yavod mehera u'bekalut," and also here the Abarbanel says as well, "V'amar ze al melech Ashur." Okay, very good. Okay, so we have finished basically chapter 5. So chapter 6 we've already studied. So next time we will skip over to chapter 7. Okay, chapter 7 is going to be a very big leap in time of a good number of years from until now. We were speaking in the times of Uzziyahu, and in chapter 7 he switches over to Uzziyahu's grandson Achaz. So we will have a big leap in time, but to the period where Ashur is not just in the future, but it's actually in the present, and how Achaz dealt with them, and how Yeshayahu said they need to be dealt with, etc. That will be sort of the beginning of the fulfillment of the prophecies of Yeshayahu at this time. Any other questions or comments?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania is fantastic, the way the Gemara, it's amazing.
Right.
I'd never believe, first of all, I'd struggle with it. I'd never believe that's exactly, he's referring back to this. Possibly.
Right.
But
yeah, it's very interesting.
maybe Rabbi Hoshua ben Hanania also passed on that. He also understood it the way Jeffrey said, you
It
know.
could be, it could be. That's a
Yes.
simpler explanation. But
That's, yeah, it's very nice.
it's also, I think, an interesting explanation as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Brilliant.
Thanks very much. Bye, that's all.
Okay, good
Thank
night.
you very, very much.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye, Eve.
Bye, Flora. Bye, Jeffrey. Bye.
Bye,
Bye,
Thank
Jeff.
you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
That's,